starting when I was 8 through high school, I was in White Plains, New York, which is about 45 minutes from Manhattan. So I grew up in a pretty interesting, actually musical and technological house. My mom is a pianist and went to Juilliard and decided after Juilliard that she, actually maybe when I was born, she decided to be a music teacher rather than a touring musician. So I'm the oldest of 3 kids and was kind of her guinea pig to learn how to teach. And my dad was an engineer and was one of the first people in the field of computer graphics. So both of them actually influenced the music that we listened to. My mom was totally immersed in the Western classical tradition, of course, particularly interested in chamber music and solo music. My dad grew up in Iowa and was a kind of a popular culture type guy, but he was a visual person, not so much a musician. But the two of them together were really, really interested in contemporary music and quite edgy music, partly because of my dad's interest in technology. And my mom had actually studied with several people at Juilliard, but one of them was Eduard Steuermann, who was a student of Schoenberg. So I listened to kind of everything by Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn for sure. I think at home, my listening kind of stopped probably in 1830, so it was kind of early music until 1830, and then maybe jumped to 1910 or something like that. But we listened to a lot of Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, Stravinsky, and then a huge amount of electronic music and you know, Cage and Babbitt and early, you know, Stockhausen. We had kind of LPs from all those guys. So no popular music. So I got interested in popular music when I was about 13. But until I was 13, it was kind of odd, because I'm a cellist, so I played a lot of chamber music. I couldn't stand playing in orchestra. I loved playing solo and chamber music. But really listened only to classical music and weird avant-garde music until the Beatles came along, and then it was like a light bulb, then it changed. So I started on piano when I was really young, 2 or 3. I think my mom tells the story that I wanted to play piano, but I kind of suspect she wanted me to play piano. So I started early as her first piano student, and she was an amazing teacher because I don't know where this came from. She's generally a very creative person, but from the very beginning, we would do our piano lessons, but then she would also always ask, you know, there'd be a few of us around the same age. She'd be teaching and she'd say, could you stay for a little bit after the lesson? Let's try a few things. So she'd say, I'll give you 5 minutes to go around the house and everybody bring back something that makes an interesting sound. So we'd go and bring back a book or a lamp or a whatever. And then she'd say, okay, what sound does that make? And oh, great, what's the loudest sound you can make with that? Oh, and what's the softest sound? What's it like with those two sounds together? Oh, great. So what word would you use to describe that sound? Then we'd do that for a little while, and then she'd say, okay, so we have a bunch of sounds and different ways of playing with them, and then some words and feelings. Let's make a little story out of these. What should come first? And so in 15 or 20 minutes, we made a story, which was a piece, of course. And then she'd say, when you go home this week, why don't you just make a picture of what we did so that when we come back next week, we can remember it, we'll try it again. And so in that little time, you know, you can see I realized that music was something anybody could make, and it was something that, you know, the system of music wasn't something predetermined. It was whatever you needed to tell your story, and even something like notation was just a way of making an image of what you'd done so you could remember it and reinterpret it. So that was the start of music. And I studied with my mom piano until I was about 6 or 7, and then I think 2 things happened. One, like often happens, somebody at school said, oh, there's a chance to play an instrument at school, and who would like to play an instrument? And that was about the time when I would get up really early in the morning to practice, and wherever I was in the house, I think my parents were still sleeping, but my mom would say, don't, maybe, shouldn't that be an F sharp? And so I think those two things together made me pick another instrument. So I changed to cello when I was about 7. And then pretty much played, I went to the Bach suites almost immediately. And, from age 7 to now, just they're limitless. So I play those all the time. Played all the sonata literature. My mom was very good at finding, especially trios, like a piano, violin, cello for me to play with all through growing up. So I played a lot of chamber music. I played in orchestra, but never really liked that so much. And then when I was about 12 or 13, I got interested in rock music, and also I'd been listening to all this electronic music through the family and got really interested in just mashing up my cello. Luckily, I didn't literally mash it up, but I figured out pretty quickly how to make quite unusual sounds on the cello, and I built a little studio at home with a tape recorder and microphones, and those were the days where you had to literally cut the tape with a razor and slice it. And but I learned all of that, and was lucky to have a friend of mine in, I think I met him in 9th grade, who was a fantastic guitarist and pianist. So we formed a band and wrote music for that. And yeah, so by the time, my last years of high school were really interesting, because it was a mixture of classical chamber music and being really interested in avant-garde music. I even took some classes at a local conservatory in, I guess at that time there were people like Roger Reynolds I remember studying when I was in 10th grade or 11th grade, and Elliott Carter and Cage I'd kind of grown up with, but and then rock music at the same time. So it was all mixed by the time I got to college. When I was in high school, I think the last couple of years of high school, I took composition lessons at, it was called Westchester Conservatory, and I enjoyed that. I didn't particularly think of myself as a composer then. I wrote some pieces which I think are probably in a drawer somewhere at my parents' house, but I haven't looked at those pieces in a long time. And it's funny, when I was a senior in high school, I went to a place called Fieldston in New York, which is a really, really interesting, creative high school. There were a lot of really neat kids there. And in high school, I was interested in many things. I could have gone a lot of different directions. By the time I was in 11th or 12th grade, I knew I didn't want to be a cellist. I'm quite a good cellist, actually, but to me, it didn't feel fulfilling enough to just have cello and cello performance as my main activity. But I knew I wanted to do something in music. So I decided to go to UC Santa Cruz. I got into most of these places, but decided I wanted to get out of the East Coast. I've always been attracted to California, and it was very different, especially then in the 70s, was quite different than being in Manhattan. So I went to UC Santa Cruz, and it was just one of these funny things. Within, I think, like a week of getting there, I realized that, sorry, I'm remembering that. It was within like a week of getting there, I realized that composing is what was my calling, is what I wanted to do. And that I think it's partly because Santa Cruz at that moment had attracted some of the most creative people in California. So there were all these young people who were just unusual and very bright, but also adventurous. And it was an interesting combination of being very creative and also being intellectual. But I just realized, I can't remember exactly why, that this combination of imagining something in your head and using pure creativity, but also structure and what music is for and what it means, and the process of being isolated to think about it, and then being very social to rehearse it and perform it, and then it just clicked immediately. So my answer, getting to college for some reason immediately told me that being a composer is what I wanted to do. So I was living in Europe when I met the Kronos Quartet. They came and did some performance. And while I was at EarCom, I got my first really big commission, which was from the Tokyo String Quartet. I can't remember how they heard about me, but they asked me to write a string quartet. And I thought I was a big shot, and I was at EarCom and the Tokyo Quartet, and they were going to premiere it at Carnegie Hall. And so for me, I must have been, I don't know, 23 or something, and I thought, I can do anything I want. I can write, and I'd studied with Carter, and I was interested in complexity anyway. So I wrote a totally crazy, very difficult piece and sent it off as my commission to the Tokyo. And the Tokyo had already announced their season. I'll never forget, there was the big page in the New York Times with the Carnegie Hall season, and the Tokyo Quartet was featured, and there was my string quartet. And I sent it to them, and I remember a month or two had gone by, and I hadn't heard from them. So I called Peter Ungen, who was the first violinist at that point, and said, hey, Peter, just curious how it's going, and, love to come to a rehearsal. And Peter said, well, we're working on it. The concert's in a couple of months, and it's quite a hard piece, but we're getting there, and why don't you call back in a couple of weeks? So I called back in a couple of weeks, and Peter said, well, we're still working at it. It's taking a really long time for us to learn. And then he took a pause and he said, we're not going to be able to learn this in time for the premiere, and we're never going to be able to play this piece. It's just too hard, and we don't get it. and for me, you can imagine it was just devastating, because I'd had this opportunity and I'd written a piece that I believed in, but I honestly didn't realize exactly how crazy it was, and so they didn't do it. And I think a year or so went by, and again, I forget exactly how, but somehow I'd been asked to do a concert at Symphony Space in New York in association. It was a joint concert with George Lewis, who's a wonderful composer at Columbia University now. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity to do this string quartet. And so I called David Harrington. And there was no email in those days. I must have called him or something and said, David, I've got a pretty tricky string quartet, which I would love to have you guys take a look at. And there is a concert at Symphony Space, and I would love to have you consider it. And they did, and they considered it, and they played the heck out of it. I mean, I think it was hard for them, but it didn't look hard. They gave a spectacular performance. That was in 1984, and we've been friends ever since. We were having a cup of coffee on in a street cafe. It was actually a pretty noisy street, and if I remember, it was like kind of raining, one of those San Francisco days, so it wasn't like a sunny, nice day. But we were talking, and David said, we're starting this new project, 50 for the Future, and explained what the basic idea was. And he said, we're asking 50 composers to write kind of short pieces, and they're to make this repertoire for the future. They're designed for all quartets, but really with a mission to make a repertoire for younger quartets. And would you be interested in doing one of these? He was particularly interested in a piece that would use electronics, based on my background, and would allow quartets to get a kind of overview or a kind of broad idea of the possibilities of electronics and string quartet now and in the future. So it was kind of a challenge to maybe not just do one specific thing, but something that might open up people's minds to what's possible with electronics. And then I'll never forget, he also said, it would be great. He said two things. The first thing he said was, if you do something with electronics, would it be possible to do it in such a way, maybe because of the association with the Media Lab, that perhaps the piece could be updated, once in a while so it doesn't become a dinosaur. And I said, well, okay, that's not so easy because, you never know. I mean, I won't be around forever. Graduate students come and go, but I will certainly think of that. And then he said, and David, he's, he'll always think of something that'll push past what you're already. So then he said, and would you be willing to think of something that conceptually would pose questions involving music and involving electronics that would be provocative, open-ended, something so that a quartet would be able to think about the potential, and maybe even 10, 25, 50 years from now, people could look at this piece and say, oh, there's something that Tod is proposing in this piece that is still unsolved or is still stimulating, and let's make another version of it, or let's make another version of the electronics. And so I said, oh, I get it. That's difficult, but that's a challenge. I totally am willing to think about that. So let me go away and think. I wrote a piece which is called, the piece is called Gamified, and it's based on, it took me a while to put the pieces together, but for about 2 years now, we've been doing research based on some discoveries that have been made by a couple of my colleagues at MIT. One's a person named Ed Boyden here at the Media Lab. The other is a scientist named Li-Wei Tsai, who's over at the Memory Institute at MIT. It's called the Picower Institute. And they both discovered about 2 years ago, kind of by accident, that flashing lights at 40 hertz, so quite fast, they were doing research to see if they could enhance the concentration of mice, make mice more alert, somehow make them more awake. And it turned out that flashing lights at exactly 40 hertz, they noticed that normal mice were paying attention. They would stay for quite a long time and look at these lights. So they thought, well, let's try this with older mice, mice who are pretty lethargic. And sure enough, after about half a day of exposure to those same lights at 40 hertz, the older mice were also much more alert than usual. And then they said, well, let's try this with mice bred with Alzheimer's disease. And so the Alzheimer's mice, after about 2 days of exposure to just the light, were also more alert than they'd ever been, and they could find their way through a maze. And so Ed and Li-Wei said, oh my gosh, there's something going on. So they did a bunch of research and found out that one specific thing that was happening is that the arteries in the brain where plaque builds up that blocks your brain for Alzheimer's, the arteries were dilating with these frequencies, and the plaque was vacating. The plaque disappears, which there's no other way to do that. You can't get rid of plaque with medicine. You can't get rid of plaque with surgery. And so they were like, oh my God, something is going on. So they then did research and found out that audio at 40 hertz has the same effect on the brain. Then they were like, okay, there's really something crazy here. So they expanded the research. They invited us to become part of this project to find out under what conditions both audio and light at 40 hertz has an effect on mice, and then especially to find out if it has an effect on humans, which it does. And then it turns out that audio and light at 40 hertz together has off the charts powerful effect that nobody predicted. And so this is a growing research field that we all think is very promising. And one of the main things now is to find out with humans in particular, do you have to have these 40 hertz signals going all the time? Can the 40 hertz sound, for instance, be included in other sounds? What's the most, do you need to do this like for an hour a day for a year? Do you need to have it in your environment all the time? Can you have like a jolt of this for like a cup of coffee for 10 minutes? We don't know. So that's the research that's being done, and it's really exciting. The most exciting thing about this, to me, is that it's the first research that I know that shows that there's some sensory stimulus that's specific. It's like this frequency in light, in sound, that has a particular effect on your brain that is measurable and is positive. And to me, that opens a door. There must be many other frequencies and many other, it's the first thing that's measurable that I think we can build both research on and build maybe a new art form on. So all of a sudden I thought, maybe what I should do with this piece with the Kronos is to make the first music composition with these gamma frequencies embedded into the composition, build a piece where the gamma frequencies are there for the entire composition, and the piece is an experiment in how the quartet can reinforce the gamma frequencies, can pull different aspects of the frequencies out as part of the composition, can have a shape to it so that as a listener, well, it's interesting. What did I want to do? I wanted to make a piece that was had the effects of the gamma frequencies present. So if you listen to the piece, you're in a therapy set. I mean, you're having these frequencies delivered. I wanted something where the audience, the listener, would be aware of these frequencies all the time, so they weren't, what's the word? It wasn't like a subconscious experience. It was partly, you could focus on the gamma sound if you wanted to, but there's also a lot of other things to listen to. And I wanted a kind of unusual balance between, I didn't want people to be focused 95% on the string quartet with something else happening, and I didn't want them focused 95% on, the gamma frequency with the quartet kind of. I wanted it to be a real blend. And it's a very interesting experience because this frequency, it's 40 hertz, so it's basically the low E on the piano or the low E on the double bass. So it's a note that we know, but we've done a lot of research to figure out what harmonics over that frequency need to be there to create the most effective response in the brain. So that those frequencies are present. And David said it yesterday when we started rehearsing this. He said, it's kind of like a meditation, but it's not a meditation. It's actually an activation. It's an experience that is meant to recreate this frequency in the brain, because what it turns out, what the researchers at MIT discovered is that nobody knew this. Everybody knew that there were gamma frequencies in your brain, but nobody ever knew what they were for. And what we've discovered over the last 2 years is that almost everything that goes wrong in your brain, whether it's Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's disease or normal depression, something goes wrong with these gamma frequencies. So we're not sure what they're doing when they're there, but when they're not there, your brain's ability, many different things seem to go wrong. So it looks like restoring the gamma health in your brain is central to many other things. So this gamma therapy is a way to get your brain to create on its own the gamma frequency again, whether it's, sometimes the gamma frequency is, it's intermittent, so it's on and off. Sometimes it's distorted, sometimes it moves to the wrong frequency. So the research is how to restore that, and this piece is the first musical exploration of a gamma experience embedded in a music composition. I'll produce a version where a young quartet could remix my electronics if they want to. Since the research in gamma frequencies and what they do to our brain is going to assumedly just grow and grow and grow, I'll update the project with the latest version of the kind of gamma layer. Who knows, once every 6 months, once every 3 months, maybe it'll develop faster than that. We'll make the new research into gamma frequencies available on the website to anybody, so that quartets who are really interested might decide that they want to take my piece and take these electronics and make their own gamma frequencies and remix those into the electronics. And so I think that it turns out to be a pretty sophisticated piece that isn't that difficult to play and has this idea of, what these gamma frequencies mean that's just starting as a field. And I have a feeling that for quite a while, it'll be a growing field that quartets, if the more interested they are, can readapt this piece to make use of the latest research. So, and with any luck, it sounds interesting as a piece. That's what we'll find out. We're playing it for an audience as kind of a sort of an experiment tomorrow here at MIT. So we'll get feedback from a group of people who don't know the piece at all for the first time tomorrow, and we'll take it from there. I think some people think that art forms are the unique place where our creativity is expressed. And in music, it's a particularly dangerous thing because there's a huge amount of snobism about a fairly small number of composers who have been, who truly are remarkable. Like, I could probably listen to Bach and Beethoven for the rest of my life and be fully satisfied, but there's so many other people who have done amazing things in music. And so I think creativity is a funny word. We often think that there are only special people who are creative, and art forms are particular ways of being creative. Turns out art's a wonderful place to kind of practice your creativity and to have a kind of safe space to allow your imagination to go kind of anywhere without any constraints in the real practical world. But I think it's really important that we learn to be creative in everything we do in our lives, whether it's the way we listen to a friend, or the way we prepare a meal, or the way we structure our days, or so I think we all have kind of positive and negative things, and we try to develop our positive sides and try to avoid our I think I've always been kind of a creative person for whatever reason, just naturally, maybe my parents or my genes, or so I think but for me, I think trying to look at every single thing that I'm faced with in my life, day to day, large scale, with a freshness, without preconceptions, with a sense of what's the most appropriate thing to do now, or what I think applying creativity to every single thing that we do and every single moment is the challenge and the task of our lives. I think to anybody in the future who is interested in playing this particular piece, I think on the one hand, if you look at the score, there are a few tricky rhythms, but I think it looks pretty simple. There, if you compare it to any other piece by me, it's very simple. I mean, there are a few tricky rhythms, but it looks kind of straightforward. But I think that what's interesting about it is that if you open your minds and open your ears and think about the sound, even this gamma frequency, it's just a low E that kind of buzzes. It's sort of like a sound like that. I think the piece is an invitation to see how much richness there is in a simple sound. And in this particular sound, which research has shown actually literally stimulates your mind, that the quartet there's a real invitation in this particular piece to be creative as a quartet, not just to shape a performance, but to think about how to help deliver this sonority to an audience. And I think more than anything else, this piece is an invitation to think about music as being more than just being expressive and sharing with an audience something about what you're feeling as musicians. And maybe for that matter, to think about music as being something more than being beautiful or being a story. I think in this particular case, this is a piece of music which actually can change somebody's health and actually can change the way somebody's mind works. I'm not saying it's like a magic pill, but I'm saying that the piece is an example of music as being part of the broader world and of being able to change the world in maybe ways that as a young quartet you haven't thought of. Because I think that music is one of the most powerful media and one of the most powerful tools that we have. You know, you're so lucky to be playing string instruments or any instrument. Maybe you're another kind of quartet, maybe not even a string quartet. To be able to be playing as a group of four, to listen to each other, to being able to play for an audience, and to be able to bring an experience to people which can really change people's lives. And I think as a young quartet, as young musicians in particular, what I would leave you with is the potential as, you know, you've chosen this path because you want to communicate with people. But I think the ability to help people to think differently, to act differently, to make the world better is so much larger than I can imagine, so much larger than you can imagine. And if you spend your lives pushing what music can do for the world, to stretch that as far as you can, not only will you have a rich life, but you really will be able to leave something that really matters.